Good day. Before I proceed with this video, a brief apology. I'm making this video with a bad cold. As many of you who've been following my videos will know, I was out of London this weekend on private business matters. I stayed overnight on Saturday night at a country house hotel, well-regarded country house hotel. My room, however, had no central heating and no hot water and no internet. As a result, the following morning, I came down with a head cold. So maybe this is a sign of the economic and financial pressures that businesses like that particular hotel are under. I'm not going to speculate further, but the fact is that I do have a head cold and a slight temperature, and in light of this, I'm going to try to keep this video reasonably contained and short, and for that, obviously, I apologise. I should say that if I'm even more rambling than usual, put it down to the fact that with a temperature and a cold, it's not always easy to keep concentrated. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about that. What's going on? Well, I think that yesterday and indeed today are enormously consequential days in the Ukraine conflict. They could be the decisive ones. But before I discuss that in detail, I'll just do what I always do, give you a, this time rather brief summary of what's going on the various battlefields. There were more Ukrainian attacks along the battle lines in Kherson region over the previous 24 hours. So far as I can see, these achieved nothing of consequence. On the contrary, a Russian military unit, which is stationed at the important ford of Davidov Brod, has apparently reported back that it fought the Ukrainians to a standstill there and drove them back several kilometers and destroyed a fair amount of their equipment. Now, there are rumors circulating, pushed especially hard by Rybar, this rather interesting Telegram channel, or blog, if you prefer, that the Ukrainians are preparing some major amphibious assault on the Kinburn Spit near Kherson city, and with apparently 2 battalions. That would be, I guess, roughly 1,000 men. And this is all part of some last attempt, presumably, to achieve some kind of decisive outcome in this offensive in Kherson region. Now, I'm not, as I've said so many times, a military man. This does look to me a very, very high-risk assault if it really is going to be carried out. And of course, the fact that Rybar apparently knows all about it must mean that the Russians do as well. And I would have thought that an assault of this kind, which has been discussed and publicised and spoken about in advance, is going to run into obvious problems given the heavy preponderance of artillery that the Russians possess in this part of Ukraine. I will say one further thing. The Rybar report was incredibly detailed about the Ukrainian preparations for this assault. It even discussed some of the Ukrainian military units that had been assigned, earmarked to carry it out, the locations where they're based, the training areas, all that kind of thing. It spoke about the ships that would be used, the helicopters that would be used to support this assault. I do ask myself, where does Rybar get this information? Does it get it from Russian intelligence, or does it get it from sources within the Ukrainian military? If so, it does make me wonder, one way or the other, why after so many months of this war, with Rybar regularly publicising this kind of very detailed information, why, if it is accurate and true, the Ukrainians haven't been able to scotch its Rybar's source. Of course, there is another possibility that this is all an elaborate disinformation exercise? Well, I'm not going to speculate. I have no way of knowing one way or another. Rybar also, by the way, has reported another very elaborate and complex plan by Ukraine to launch some kind of offensive in Zaporozhye region. Now this is an area where I said yesterday that the Russians have heavily reinforced and seem confident that if an offensive of that nature is indeed launched, then they can repel it. Well, again, Rybar provided a huge amount of information, including a council of war held by the Ukrainian commanders, in which they discussed and apparently agreed the directions and objectives of this offensive, which from the look of it, by the way, seems fairly limited. I do wonder again how exactly Rybar has been able to get information about what is presumably a secret Ukrainian council of war. I mean, these are just questions. I don't necessarily want or expect answers, but I just throw them out. Anyway, further east, we're not getting much information, at least I've not seen much information about what's going on around Donetsk city. But in Bakhmut itself, the Wagner group has now captured an electricity substation, which apparently is important for providing energy, power and energy across northern Donbass. But perhaps it's even more important in terms of the fighting for Bakhmut, in that it's on elevated ground and it provides excellent sight lines for enabling the Russians, according to the Russians, the Allied forces, if you prefer, to see large areas of the Bakhmut area, including the important suburb of Zaitsevo, where the Wagner group is also apparently fighting. So more advances, it seems, by the Wagner group in Bakhmut. My own sense is that this is by far the most intense and important battle being fought at the moment. It seems that Ukrainian losses in this area are extremely high, and it seems also that there are again complaints from some of the Ukrainian units that have been committed to this battle, that they are all but forgotten by the authorities in Kiev, that they're sent to fight without proper equipment, ammunition, all those sort of things. There's a video circulating which looks like it's true of a unit in this particular area, Ukrainian unit in this particular area, addressing exactly that sort of complaint to President Zelensky. We've seen much of that over the course of the war. We've seen less of it recently, perhaps because the Ukrainians have had this morale uplift following the successful offensive in Kharkiv region, but it looks as if it's back. Anyway, further north still, there's intense fighting going on in northern Donetsk city around a town called Krasny Liman, formerly Liman when it was controlled by the Ukrainians. The Russians, to the best of my memory, captured it in May, without much resistance, by the way. It's now being defended by various irregular Cossack units, though there is Russian artillery apparently operating, supporting these units. And there's been fighting around Liman or Krasny Liman underway for 2 weeks, with the Ukrainians trying to recapture this city, this town. Now, the leader of the Donetsk People's Republic, a man called Denis Pushilin, has said that the DPR militia is now on the offensive in this area. I'm not sure what that means. I'm not even sure that's true, but perhaps and plausibly there is some attempt being made to recapture, to support this garrison in Krasny Liman, which is under attack by the armed forces of Ukraine. And further north still, there is continued sporadic fighting around the Oskol River, with apparently the Ukrainians grudgingly accepting that they have not been able to successfully penetrate the Oskol River line, which the Russians have established. Now that, it seems to me, is a reasonable summary of the state of the fighting at the moment. As I said, the most important battle, in my opinion, up to this moment, is the battle for Bakhmut City. Everybody seems to agree if Bakhmut City falls, it'll mark a fundamental change in the dynamic of the war in Donbass. It will be the moment when one can start to say that the battle of Donbass, the battle of the Donbass arc of operations, as the Russians refer to it, is finally within sight of coming to an end. Anyway, that's where we are. I'm going to add one other little point, which I did find quite interesting, which is that, as I said in my previous program, it does look as if the Russians are now indeed importing large numbers of kamikaze drones from Iran. And interestingly, one of the targets for these drones will be HIMARS vehicles, not just the trucks, but presumably the tracked vehicles as well. There's apparently been some difficulty. The Russians have had some difficulty destroying the HIMARS vehicles, because apparently the time frame from launch of the missiles to the truck moving is very short, about 2 minutes. So the Ukrainian operators of these HIMARS can launch and scoot very effectively, and it's not always easy for the Russians to keep track on them. But the point is that these kamikaze drones, which operate in pairs apparently, can certainly outrun a HIMARS vehicle, and they can pursue it. And so we are now being given a rather strange vision of a HIMARS vehicle launching missiles and scooting, and then being chased and presumably eventually destroyed by Iranian-built Russian kamikaze drones. I have to say, if this is really true, if this sort of thing really happens, then the shape of war is indeed changing in all kinds of unexpected ways. Anyway, all of this is the prelude to the actually big news of the day, and in my opinion this is very big news, and that is that, as you may recall, a couple of days ago, about a week ago, shortly after the Ukrainian victory in Kharkiv, I mentioned how the political institutions in Moscow had plunged into silence, and I said that this was a clear sign that some kind of discussion within the senior ranks of the Russian leadership was underway. A decision was being made about how to take this special military operation in Ukraine forward. And I spent several days and several videos, both on this channel and with my colleague Alex Christoforou, speculating that the Russians might be intending to upgrade the special military operation into a counter-terrorist operation. Well, I think that has turned out to be wrong, or at least partly wrong, because I think we now know, as of yesterday, what the actual decision was that the Russian leadership has taken, and it is one that goes far beyond upgrading the special military operation into a counter-terrorist operation. The decision that has been taken is to move forward immediately with the incorporation of Kherson region, Zaporozhye region, apart from the city of Zaporozhye, and importantly the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, into Russia itself. And to that end, there's been a whole series of announcements in all of these territories, importantly, especially in Donbass, about holding simultaneous referendums there in order to join Russia. Now, there was some speculation a couple of days ago that there was a plan to hold these referendums simultaneously on the 4th of November. But my guess is that this has now been brought forward and that it will happen within the next week or so. In other words, this has suddenly been given urgent priority. Now, the deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, has explained in a tweet the implications of this decision. If the two republics of the Donbass, if Zaporozhye region, if Kherson region all vote to join Russia, and if the Russian parliament, the Duma, or rather I should say I think here, the Federal Assembly and Putin himself agree to admit them, and that looks to me a foregone conclusion. Important Russian parliamentarians, including the Speaker of the Duma, have spoken out in support of these referendums. So I think that's a foregone conclusion. Then, if that happens, these territories become part of Russia. Ukrainian encroachments, as Medvedev put it, on the territory the territory of these regions, of these two republics and of the other regions, would then be encroachments on Russian territory. And at that point, the entire might of the Russian military machine would be turned towards expelling what would be in effect an invader or an occupier from the territory of Russia. It would not just be an upgrade of the special military operation, it would be a complete transformation of the special military operation into an outright defense of Russian territory. Now, why has this happened, and why has this happened so suddenly? Well, partly the explanation, I am sure, is the Kharkiv counteroffensive and its implications, and its, the shock effect it has had, which should not be underestimated. Having said that, my own feeling, it's only a feeling, and I've said many times I'm not a military person, is that the Ukrainian offensives are now starting to run down and run out of time. And there's a rumour, and again one can only call it a rumour, though it's been reported by supposedly reliable sources, that General Zaluzhny has apparently advised President Zelensky as much in his latest report in Kiev. He's apparently or supposedly told President Zelensky, General Zaluzhny has, that the Ukrainian military has suffered very severe losses over the course of these offensives. It's lost many men. It's perhaps even more importantly lost an awful lot of material. It's going to struggle to sustain these offensives for much longer. And beyond that, with autumn now closing in, the steppe lands of southern Ukraine, where much of this fighting is going on, are now going to become boggy or marshy, or at least soft. The ground's going to become soft, and it's going to be much more difficult to sustain offensives of this kind, especially, by the way, with the sort of equipment that the West has been supplying to Ukraine, which is not really, or so it seems to me, designed for this kind of territory and this sort of climate. So General Zaluzhny is supposedly advising President Zelensky that the time has come for Ukraine to revert to a defensive strategy. Now, as I said previously, one of the greatest, easiest traps a commentator can fall into is believing in the truth of a report simply because it appears to corroborate that which the commentator already believes is true. I happen to believe that what General Zaluzhny has supposedly outlined to President Zelensky is true, and that inclines me to think that this report is also true and that it corroborates my beliefs. But one must be honest, I don't know that it is true. It might just be a guess. It may be the General Zaluzhny is giving President Zelensky completely different advice. But having said that, this does correspond with what I am seeing others say. So to give us some examples, I understand that Scott Ritter is also now talking about the fact that the climate conditions are now making further offensives by Ukraine difficult. And I believe that there was a program on CNN in which similar sort of things were said, that Ukraine is now in danger of becoming overextended, that its forces are dispersed, that it's going to struggle to maintain the offensive that it has been engaged in up to now, and that perhaps some kind of consolidation at this point would be wiser. I haven't seen this program. I might be misunderstanding or misrepresenting it, and if so, apologies. But anyway, that's summaries of what it has said, or supposedly said, which I have seen. Anyway, there we are. So it could be that military developments on the battlefields have pushed the Russians to this decision. I think the psychological shock of the Kharkiv offensive, which should not be underestimated, regardless of what its actual military effect was, that has also played a role. But I'm going to make a further guess. I am, in fact, absolutely sure about this. I believe that the major cause, the thing that has made it possible for the Russians to press forward with these referendums and to incorporate these territories into Russia itself, is that they had discussions during the conference in Samarkand with their key friends, China, India, and no doubt other countries, Turkey as well, and that they now feel confident that they can go ahead with this sort of move without incurring the anger or the concern of those important countries. Now, I say that because I've no doubt that the eventual plan all along has been to incorporate all these territories into Russia. I can remember that right at the very start of the war, indeed before the war technically began, on the 21st of February, there was a meeting of the Russian Security Council in Moscow, the entirety of which was shown on television, and it was purportedly undertaken in order to discuss whether or not to recognize the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Now, obviously, this meeting of the Security Council was partly staged, but there was, it seemed to me, when I was watching it, some real debate also going on. Though, obviously not the kind of unconstrained debate there would have been if it had happened, as it nearly always does, behind closed doors. But over the course of that discussion, one of its participants, I forget who, made a Freudian slip. He spoke about the annexation of the two republics of the Donbass. And Putin immediately corrected him and said, this is not on the agenda. Now, the fact, however, that somebody at that Security Council meeting did in fact mention the word annexation, Anschluss, as the Germans would say, does suggest to me that it was at least on some people's and perhaps on everybody's minds at that meeting. In fact, I'm going to go much further. I'm going to say that I'm pretty sure that this has been what they've been talking about for months, both months preceding this, in the event that the diplomacy, the attempt to sort this thing out diplomatically through the Minsk agreement failed. And I suspect that they've been talking about this ever since. And we've had stop-go suggestions about referendums in some of these regions. So there was talk at one time that Kherson region was going to have a referendum to join Russia on the 11th of September. Now, the Russians never publicly endorsed that. There was never any indication that the Russian government itself was willing to go along with that. And eventually, the idea of holding a referendum on the 11th of September in Kherson region was called off. Notice that there was no other suggestions at that time of referendums in Donetsk and Lugansk or in Zaporozhye. Now, I suspect that the Kherson referendum idea was being floated as a trial balloon to see what the reaction internationally would be. But I think what probably has happened is that having come to Samarkand, having discussed the situation in Ukraine at length with the Chinese and Indian leaders, the Russians now feel that the moment has come when they can press ahead with these referendums without this causing their friends in China and India any special concern or embarrassment. I think they've been able to persuade, or at least they believe they've been able to persuade, the Chinese and the Indians that Russia has bent over backwards to be as reasonable as it can. It's offered negotiations, it's offered talks, it's made proposals, it spent 8 years over the Minsk agreement, which was never implemented, even though it was backed by a resolution of the UN Security Council. It negotiated in good faith in March, but the Western powers pulled the plug on those negotiations. Zelensky, under Western encouragement, is not making any real proposals for negotiations either. The West seems to be instead on a crusade against Russia, and that the point has now come to bring this whole business to an end. And of course, China and India do have concerns about supporting secession in another country, and they will never publicly, I think, endorse this move. But against that, the Chinese and the Russians are deeply patriotic people, leaders of these countries are, and it seems to me that Putin has been working extremely hard over the last year, since long before the actual fighting began, to explain to the Chinese and the Indians and to opinion in the global south that the territory that is being fought over in Ukraine is part of the historic Russian homeland, and that the people who live there are Russians. There was that extraordinary long essay that he wrote about a year ago, which caused all that anger and annoyance in the West, in which he talked about Russia and Ukraine as fraternal nations. It was one people, in fact. And then there was the rather rambling speech that he gave when he ordered the special military operation. Well, actually, not when he ordered the special military operation, but when he confirmed his decision to recognize the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And it went into all kinds of details about the history. And of course, none of that cut any ice in the West. I pointed out many times it was much more attentively heard in Russia itself. But of course, no one in the West ever considers that Putin was probably addressing a third audience as well, which was China, India, and the global south. And in these countries, telling them that this is a problem created by the separation of territories from the historic motherland, and that the West instead of seeking a peaceful solution, has been pursuing policies which appear to be aimed at ending Russian presence in this part of their historic motherland. In nations like China, India, many other nations, that kind of thing will carry a great deal of traction. So I think that the Russians now feel that with the latest American moves, the dispatch of arms supplies to Ukraine, with Boris Johnson's various visits to Kiev, with every speech that Ursula von der Leyen and Robert Habeck and all of those people make, they probably feel that after they've had these discussions in Samarkand with the Chinese and Indian leaders, that the point has now been reached when they can finally take the steps necessary to end this thing by announcing these referendums, holding these referendums, incorporating these territories into Russia, sending in not just a Russian expeditionary force, but a proper commitment by the Russian military sufficient to end this war. Or so they hope. And that, I think, explains some other things. Firstly, anybody who watched that press conference that Putin gave in Samarkand, which I've discussed in another video, would have noticed that he looked extremely confident and pleased. And I think the reason he felt confident and pleased is because he was pleased with the support he felt he got, the attentive ear he got from his Chinese and Indian friends. And going beyond that, we've also seen over the last few hours that an important Russian official, Nikolai Patrushev, the secretary of Russia's Security Council, Putin's national security advisor, he's been having talks, I presume in Beijing, with Yang Jiechi, who fulfills the role of national security advisor for Xi Jinping. Now again, we're not really told exactly what the purpose of this meeting is, but Patrushev seemed to come away pleased with the outcome. And again, I can't help but think that Ukraine and the problems there were high on the agenda, and that the Russians made known to the Chinese their intention to press forward with these referendums, and let's say that they got no pushback from the Chinese about them. So that, I think, is why the referendums are taking place now. Doing so earlier, right at the start of the war, might have been a much harder sell in Beijing and Delhi. It might have looked like Russia was pursuing or conducting a war of conquest in Ukraine. Waiting until this point, allowing the mood amongst the Chinese and Indian leaders to crystallize, has made it easier for the Russians to justify and explain this move, point out that this is the only realistic option, the only way of settling this conflict once and for all. So that is, I think, why it is happening now. I want to say once more that people who discuss this war and who isolate its various parts from each other, the military, the economic, the diplomatic, are not seeing it the way Putin and his officials must be seeing it from their perspective as they discuss the war in the Kremlin. Putin doesn't have the luxury of simply ignoring the diplomatic aspects of the conflict or the economic aspects. In fact, he had a long meeting about the state of the Russian economy with his government just yesterday. He can't simply ignore and disregard these things. For him, all of these things are connected. So if he's waited this long to call these referendums, because the ultimate decision maker is him, if he's waited this long to call these referendums, it will be because there were reasons, real reasons, probably diplomatic reasons, in fact I am sure diplomatic reasons, which up to this point have deterred him from doing it. Now, after the discussions he had in Samarkand, after the discussions Patrushev had in Beijing, I presume, the way is clear to go ahead. I'm going to make here a guess, and this is a real guess. I think that Patrushev's purpose in meeting with Yang Jiechi was principally in order to explain to the Chinese what what these referendums were about, why they were happening, and what they entailed. Now, before I leave this topic, there is one very important thing I want to make clear. When I said that the Russians will have discussed these referendums with their Chinese and Indian and Turkish friends, I have not said that the Chinese, Indians and the Turks have formally agreed to these referendums. I don't think that that's what they have done at all. I think that agreeing to referendums in that way would be, again, in effect, accepting that referendums could be used as a mechanism for secession. What I mean is not that the Chinese and the Indians and the Turks have agreed to these referendums. It is that they have made it clear to the Russians that in all the circumstances they are relaxed about them. That they are not going to push back against them. It's not going to interfere with economic relationships between Russia, China, India and Turkey, for example. I just want to make that clear so that there's no misunderstanding about what I'm saying. Anyway, there we are. We will see when these referendums take place. I don't think we have any real doubts about what the outcomes of these referendums will be. There may be some people in all of these places who actually would prefer to stick by Ukraine, but nobody should be naive about this. The results of these referendums will be overwhelming votes for union with Russia. There will then be a rapid decision by the Russian parliament. Putin will ratify it. Maybe there'll be another Security Council meeting. We might even have the same theatrical discussion that we saw back in February, another televised meeting. But once that happens, these territories are part of Russia, and the Russian military can be committed on a scale that it has not been up to now. The special military operation will end, and we will be seeing something entirely different. Now, what that will mean for the future, whether it will indeed bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end, how the Western powers will react, all of that remains to be seen. But it is a big move, a very big move. Its implications should not be downplayed. We will see where this thing goes. Well, as I said, this is a somewhat shorter video from me today. I hope I was reasonably clear in all that I said. Apologies again if I wasn't. And one way or the other, there'll be more from me soon. Now, can I just say, I would remind you that you can find all our videos on our other platforms, Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, and Telegram. Also, if you subscribe to us on Locals, I do live streams every Wednesday at 1900 hours Eastern Standard Time or 1400 hours London time. I have to tell you that because of this very bad cold that I have, I'm not absolutely sure I'll be able to do one tomorrow. They are pretty demanding things, and I understand also that I may be involved in another interview tomorrow. But one way or the other, usually on Wednesday, I do these live streams. If you can join me on Locals, these live streams are exclusive to Locals. I will endeavour to answer either during the live stream or in a follow-up video, whatever questions you put to me. And of course, you can also join us. You can also support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video, and by going to our shop and buying the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. And have a very good day. Until then.